how's it going, everybody? I'm Sam. I'm a student of the Bible. I'm a pastor. Been a pastor for 22 years, and you can read my writings on samberg.org. My training involves biblical studies, theology, and biblical languages. I haven't done a Bible translation video in a while, and so today I'm going to be talking about this, the New Living Translation. I actually really love the New Living Translation for certain things, and I don't use it for other things. And so I'm going to talk about that real quick. Really quick here, just some kind of information about the New Living Translation. If you are someone who's looking for recommendations on Bible translations, that kind of stuff, I would highly recommend the New Living Translation for a specific group of people. And if you are a different group of people, I would say maybe not, okay? First, Tyndale Publishing, they're the ones who came out with the Living Bible back in the day. And then they came out with the New Living Translation. I want to say it was sometime 90s-ish is when they came out with this. And a lot of translators worked on it. Tyndale really did a good job at getting a big group of, I think they say like 90 translators on this. And so here are some of the famous names for translating. Darrell Bock from Dallas Theological Seminary is on there, D.A. Carson, F.F. Bruce, Scott McKnight, who was formerly a professor at Northern Seminary, Robert Mounts, John Walton from Wheaton, and of special interest to me. So I said on my channel I'm going back to school in the fall, which will be like in a month here, and I'm going to be heading to Ashland Theological Seminary in Ohio, but online. And the person I'm going to be doing Hebrew with, not this year but next year, is David Baker, and he's actually one of the translators. He helped translate Leviticus in New Living Translation, so that's kind of a cool thing. But anyway, all these 90 translators to make this thing happen. They're either translated, they edited, they looked through it. I mean, this thing has been well looked over. It was based on critical texts, okay? So New Testament, Greek, and then Hebrew and Aramaic in the Old Testament, the critical texts, the Masoretic text, all that kind of, they looked it over and reworked it. So here's what the New Living Translation is. The New Living Translation, they say it right on their website, is that they tried to, the best that they could, stick to a literal translation where they felt like it was easy to read. Their goal of the New Living Translation is to make it easily accessible and readable in the common language, okay, in common English. That was their goal. And so where they could stay literal to the word for word in the Hebrew, the Greek, the Aramaic, they did. But where they felt like that didn't work in common English, they became more dynamic in how they translated. And so, if you've ever read through like ESV, New American Standard, those kind of more like word for word kind of translations, you can know that they can get a little bit like, they don't flow as well. And so the New Living Translation, they wanted to make it easy and accessible to read for people of all ages. And so what they did was they became very dynamic in their translating when sentences didn't make sense in English. So there's not a lot of backwards language. There's not a lot of like wooden translation. It's very smooth to read. And so it's considered more of a functional equivalent, not a formal equivalent, but they try as best they can to stay formal where they feel like they can. And so you see that all throughout as you're reading it, which I think is a cool thing. Okay, so pros and cons. Some of the pros that I think about the New Living Translation are that it is easy to understand. It's easy to read. It feels good to read. It doesn't feel like you have to really go, what is that even trying to say? Like sentences flow well together. I love the layouts of these Bibles too. They stick pretty, this is, pretty much just kind of paragraph by paragraph kind of thing, except for in the Psalms. The Psalms is very much, poetry language, that kind of stuff, or poetry setup. Easy to read and understand. And then I think personally, it's a very helpful translation for people who are newer to the scriptures, who what I've heard and what I've experienced is that I don't get as frustrated reading the New Living Translation as I would other translations. I don't get as frustrated in the reading of it. My kids don't get as frustrated in the reading when they read it versus like something like the King James, New King James, New American Standard, ESV. Those are very, they don't flow as well. And so the New Living Translation, if you're into like reading novels and that kind of stuff, this will feel more like that as you read it, and you're like, oh, this feels better, So helpful for people who are newer to the scriptures to dive in and not get frustrated. Cons. Okay, so some of the cons of the New Living Translation. Something that not just I have said, but a lot of people have said over the years is that this, because there are so many people who have translated it, and because they wanted to get it down to something that flowed well in English, and they wanted to be dynamic in areas where it felt like the word-for-word translation wasn't, sometimes in those dynamic areas, it feels like they spend time interpreting instead of translating, okay? And so instead of getting a translation, you get more of an interpretation with like what we think it means and how we write it out versus what it just says, kind of a deal. And you can see that here and there in when you're reading it, especially if you're comparing it with other translations that are more formal equivalent, then you'll see it and you'll go, oh, that was a take on that, or wow. And I don't have a lot of examples to show with that, but you can actually, there's a couple websites you can look up and they'll show you like, hey, here's side-by-side verses that can show you, here's the NLT's take on this, and here's what it says word for word, kind of a deal. So that can be a con if you are someone who's really into like, what is it actually, the words actually say versus kind of what could be an interpretation or meaning of this. And then another con would be that it's not as easily to reconcile with the Greek and the Hebrew and the Aramaic. If you are someone who studies Greek, studies Hebrew, studies Aramaic texts, if you're someone in school doing that, then it doesn't always line up well, and it's more difficult. When we're doing these translations from these texts anyway, we have to kind of reorder stuff to make it make sense anyway. But if you're looking for, okay, here's the Greek and here's how they, did this, it feels like, oh, wow, it doesn't line up as easily as something like the New American Standard or the ESV or something that's a little more formal equivalent. Okay, you can't just kind of go, oh, here's this word, here's this word, here's this word, here's this word, and kind of see what the translators were doing. You have to make a little more guesses, a little more, oh, here's a whole sentence here, and it was maybe flipped completely around to try to make it make sense in English. So if you are a student of Greek or Hebrew and you pick up an NLT, it might be a little more difficult to get into that. Okay, so then finally, what I use it for and what I don't use the NLT for. What I found myself using my NLT for is personal reading, where I'm not trying to do a lot of studying, where I'm not trying to really dig into like, what does it mean? And, try to dig into like the original languages, that kind of stuff. Just plain reading of scripture, interacting with scripture, devotional reading. I love using it for that. I love using it to actually teach younger people, like teach young adults, teach teenagers, kids even. Because I think it's really accessible language for them, and it's just something when you say it, you're like, oh, that makes sense. Versus like you teach out of something else. Like even with the NIV, I'll teach out of the NIV, and so I have to explain a lot of things. Versus NLT just kind of feels like it makes more sense, and so I use it for that sometimes. What I don't use the NLT for is any academic work. It becomes too much of an interpretation of somebody else's interpretation. And so if I'm looking to do some kind of academic work with the Bible, with, school stuff, whatever, I tend to stay away from NLT. I'll use more NASB, NRSV, sometimes ESV. You can go back and see my thoughts on ESV and other videos, but I'll probably use more of those formal equivalent versions that line up a little easier with Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, so that I can use them. I can explain things better in an academic setting. Every once in a while I'll use NIV, but I will not use NLT in an academic setting. Number one, I don't think that in the academic world it's as praised as much and utilized as much. In fact, in a couple of my classes I'm taking in the fall, they say we want you to use these ones, either NASB, NRSV, ESV, something like that, or even NIV. They kind of shy away from using NIV, but and they don't want you using this in an academic setting. So that's where I wouldn't use that there. It is a really good translation, though. I really love it. At times it's an interpretation, and I would just check it against other ones to kind of see, okay, what was, a more formal equivalent, to see what was there versus how they interpreted it. But for the most part, I think it's a really good version of the Bible, a good translation of the Bible. Well, thanks for hanging out with me today. Hopefully this was informative for you. Like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you in the next one.